So we've got, I'm really, really excited about this one. So we've got Ivana Bartoletti, who wrote a book on an artificial revolution, sorry, so on politics and AI. So she's going to be joining us today talking specifically about tech privacy and ethics. It'd be good to probably have a wee chat about AI in amongst that as well. So last year, Ivana was awarded Women of the Year in Cybersecurity Awards. And just some of the stuff that she's been doing in this field is absolutely incredible, and just the ability to explain big concepts in ways that we can all understand, particularly around privacy, data law, and that intersection with politics. So this is a big issue, and I think an emerging issue for charities, where lots of you are getting the basics right around tech, but actually that big question about some of the ethics that we're seeing, and particularly at the moment where we're seeing a lot of charities boycotting Facebook ads. So even though we know it's the easiest, quickest way to reach some of the beneficiaries who are going to be accessing your services, but we're seeing ethically a lot of charities choosing to remove all their spend from that platform at the moment. And so I think we're going to see much more kind of board level wrangling around some of the tech ethics probably in this year and into next year. And actually when we start to talk about digital in a being much more of an evolved way. We'll share some resources throughout this one as well, so things like the National Cybersecurity Centre's Small Charities Guide, and we've got some other bits and pieces about privacy and security as well. I'm going to hand you over to Ivana just now.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Great, fabulous. Really, really happy to be with you here today. So I mean, the best way to do this, in my view, is do interrupt. I'm happy. Do put questions, but if you feel that I've said something you really disagree with, or you really agree with, or you have a question, I'm happy for you to just, I think there is a button that says raise hand or something. Just to make sure that I know. So yes, do interrupt me, because I just want to really have a conversation. I just want to start by, so first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm having an incredible time at the moment, because we're all having a weird time with COVID and all this, and sort of change in the way that we're living. But I'm also having a great time because I'm having discussions like this, and I'm in a lot of people, and I'm really reading this a lot. So for me, it's really important that this is sort of a two-way conversation, not just me talking. So I just want to start by saying why I wrote the book, and I just want to say I love the book because I've been in privacy law for quite a long time. And I actually got to privacy law when I was very and I was about 16 at the time, and I started to feel a little bit of unease around surveillance. Then I went into human rights, and life is strange. I was in Italy at the time, then I moved to the UK and other places, but I went into, and over the years, my approach to privacy changed a lot. And he went from a very sort of individualistic, I want to protect my data, safeguard my information, to something different. It went to something like, my data is very much a public value. And I think this has been so true, and I felt it so much during COVID, where we've all felt, and we still feel, I think, very much interconnected and interdependent on each other. Because if I have COVID and I come and talk to you face to face for 15 minutes or longer, a close distance, then I may get you ill. So the importance of our personal data as a fantastic public value has really, I think, come through during this pandemic. And it's really important that we think about this at a time where the biggest trends that we see in data, and we've seen them before COVID, and we're building on them in a post-COVID response, are, in my view, surveillance, datafication, and punishment. And I'll come in a moment to talk about that. So I wrote my book from three main areas. One is I wrote my book as a privacy person, somebody who really believes in the public value of personal data. But I also wrote my book as a policy person, as somebody who believes that the digital dividends in our society have not to be shared equally between all of us. And I wrote this book as a feminist. I'm a proud feminist. And for me, feminism is all about power. And I was growing up and I was navigating through privacy law and understanding what is the impact on technology on the way we live. I came across very quickly the fact that in our digital world, there is one element, which is the asymmetry of power, which underpins it. And this asymmetry of power is what really got me thinking a while back. And it is about, as I said earlier, it is about the digital dividends not being distributed equally. So that is about this sort of big tech, a lot of data about us, increasingly becoming part of our digital, of our infrastructure. If you think about what's been happening with COVID, these companies, they've been the ones delivering our goods. They are the ones when most people get the news. This big tech, which is now partnering with the state and governments, for example, on the COVID app, on the tracing app, they've increasingly become part of our digital infrastructure. However, there is a big asymmetry underpinning the way that we live in our digital space. And this is because of this asymmetry of power, is because of how much this information these companies hold about us, but also because that are able to understand what
Ivana,
we
you
like.
You
yes.
broke up for a minute.
Oh, did I break up?
Could you just repeat back about a minute from where you were talking?
Sure. So this like, can you hear me now? That's very strange. Can you hear me now? So there's asymmetry of power, which underpins our digital space. Is the asymmetry of power around companies holding so much about us. And we can see this in a COVID space where these companies are now partnering with government to provide essential services, like, for example, the COVID app, the tracing app. But there's a symmetry of power which underpins the digital world. It's also about the issue of how sophisticated the algorithms that follow us, curate which news we see and which news we don't see, and target us with behavioral advertising, how sophisticated these algorithms have become. So on the one hand, you have these very sophisticated algorithms. And on the other hand, you've got us humans who have not changed in decades and centuries. We're still the same ones with the same emotions and feelings that we had for centuries and millenniums. At the same time, these algorithms are becoming more and more sophisticated. So this asymmetry of power really got me thinking, because I was thinking, what is it? And how do we govern all this? And also, what is the limit? What are we happy with? And everybody's talking at the moment about artificial intelligence. And yes, I mean, artificial intelligence is great. And there are so many good things that are happening. So at the moment, we've got products that are able to detect cancer way before it manifests. At the moment, we can really have computers and robots that support young children with autism in education. And there are some really good things happening. But at the same time, I have to say that sadly, the focus of artificial intelligence over the last few years has been all geared towards two main areas: surveillance and computing advertising. Obviously, people say, well, that's where the money goes. But if you build society on these trends, and if you build our response to coronavirus and to this enormous pandemic that has been shattering our world over the last few months on these trends, surveillance, datafication, computing advertising, then I think we need to have a discussion about what is the future of artificial intelligence? Where do we want it to go? And what is the role of us as citizens? Because artificial intelligence is much more than technology. It's much more than that. It's very much, once again, about power, because AI has got the power as it is used now through these very powerful algorithms for computing advertising, the use of surveillance, which we are seeing as being enormously devastating if you look at what's going on in the US and across the world in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, when people talk about AI, they think about Terminator, or they think about supercomputers, or they think about futuristic things taking over our world. But we've got to think about what's happening here and now. And what is happening here and now is that artificial intelligence has been very much developing in the areas of surveillance and computing advertising, and it's been very much built on the trends of datafication, surveillance that we've seen emerging over the last decades. So that's the first point that I wanted to make to you is, when we think AI, let's not think about futuristic images of, potential Terminator or massive robots who would be doing all our work when we sit by the beach. The reality is that there is especially in the area of, can you hear me?
We just lost you for about 10-15 seconds.
Okay,
again, Ivana.
it's really odd today. There must be something in the with the Wi-Fi in the area, because
yeah, you're mostly completely clear. It's just very, very occasionally for just a few seconds.
Great. So that's the first point that I really wanted to make, right? So when we talk AI, please, let's not imagine a futuristic scenario, but let's think about what is happening here and now. That's the first point that I wanted to make. The second point that I wanted to make is, I talked about the big things underpinning the digital world now. And I said one is the asymmetry of power, which is, to me, is very much important. And is also what drove my feminist analysis to it, because ultimately, to me, feminism is all shifting the balance of power within society. And this is the same thing and the same process that we've got to do in the digital space. The other big thing is around datafication. And this is where I want to focus for a moment, because you work in charities, you work in a sector which is absolutely crucial for our shared values and shared ethics in our society. And I really want to focus for a moment on an area where I would love the third sector charities to be more involved and really driving the social response to it. And this is the area of datafication. So datafication is the potential, the ability, and the habit of rendering any social world phenomenon into data. Then turning this data into what drives policy decisions, what is ingested into algorithms to make those decisions, and which is also driving in the US in the first place, but more and more in the rest of the Western world, let alone some big parts of the rest of the world, algorithms replacing policy itself, and computation even replacing the law. So this datification is very much a characteristic of the situation and the world we live in. We've heard the mantra, all of us, about data. The data is this neutral thing that photographs the world as it is and can give us the way forward in understanding how to respond to a policy problem. And this is extremely problematic because there is no such thing as neutrality in data. No such thing. There is nothing more distant from neutrality than data itself, because data represents society as it is. The digital architecture that we use to really collect as much data as possible, but this data represents decades, centuries of social structures and inequalities. And when we use data to then ingest, and we ingest this data into the machines, into these algorithms, what can happen is that we then recreate and perpetuate the stereotypes that we've got into society, and we elevate them from stereotypes to prejudice because of the capacity that these machines, these algorithms have to scale up quickly the inequalities and bias that we've got in society right now. So first point really is really challenging the sanctity of data. This is really, this is a very important step that we've got to make. Because when we set up a data set, there is always a power situation there. There is somebody who's decided to elevate somebody to data to be injected into a data set. But by elevating someone, you're silencing somebody else. So the choice and the politics of data classification are absolutely important. So I really want to stop here for a moment, because this issue of data, and I'm really focusing on this to you because of the role and what you do, and how important it is that we are aware of all this. So non-neutrality of data is a really important concept. The understanding that data is, in the world we live in, behaving as capital is the next concept I want to go into. A lot of people will say to you, data is the new oil. Please do not believe them for a second. When you use oil, you've used it and it's finished. The problem with data is that when you use it again, and then you use it again, and then you repurpose it. There's nothing as oil in the data that we use. The problem with data is that the politics of data accumulation, which is accumulating as much data as possible, and it's really, really important to really understand that data is not really oil, but is behaving as capital. And by capital is driven by accumulation. And it also has the same characteristics of capital at a geopolitical and global level. by really getting a lot of data from countries that are financially poor, but data rich. And this is why a lot of us are talking about data colonialism as a new form of data, the way the data is behaving right now. I see Mary in the chat mention invisible women, and I was coming to it. The very important work that has been done from Caroline to really understand that the way that the world has been programmed has been really and has been modeled onto men. And if you look, for example, at the even the PPE kit during this pandemic, female nurses couldn't even wear them when they got them because they were not made for women. But exposes the sort of data is the product of power relationship. And in that case, is the product of men driving society, and therefore all data collection happening in a certain way. So moving forward, I wanted to say this. So data is capital, we've said. Now, people will say to you and continue to say in this sort of that, yes, data is driving society and driving decision making and all that. So really understanding the concept of data is not neutral and challenging the sanctity of data is an essential passage that we really have to go through. Now, what happens where this data gets ingested into algorithms? What happens, for example, if we start to use artificial intelligence machines, recruitment? What happens if we start using artificial intelligence to decide whether somebody has got access to a loan or not? Or whether you can have access to a house, or whether somebody can have access to employment benefits, or whether somebody can have access to a particular medicine, on how much dose of a particular medicine they need to receive because of, it is called personalized medicine in artificial intelligence. Now, there are a number of issues with that, and I really need to talk you through what is the other big thing that is very much in the public domain, which is the area of bias in algorithms. And I really want you to understand where bias in algorithms comes from, because again, we've got to challenge this sort of what is going on at the moment in terms of, so bias comes in many different ways. One way for bias to come in if is all this data, which as we said is totally not neutral, used to then make these decisions. So you put all this data, which is historic data, which is the photograph of society as it is in 2020, and you take all this data, you ingest it into these machines, and then you get these machines to learn and to make decisions about it. Of course, when these machines make decisions, the decisions will mirror what they've learned. And what they've learned is from the historic data that they've been fed. So they will learn that women get paid less than men. They will learn from historic data that some more vulnerable people from BAME backgrounds will historically commit more crime than others. And I say commit more crime because they had more surveillance and more data collection wrapped around them than others. If you look at stop and search and how it's wrapped around Black people and people of color, then the majority of the data around crime will be around them. Therefore, when it comes to ingest all this data, for example, to see who is more likely to commit a crime, the data and the outcome will reflect the data that has been ingested. And I have a question for you here, because this is where I want people to really engage in these conversations, not just with me now, but around the kitchen table and with your colleagues and friends and everybody. One thing that really, really, really concerns me is the concept and the idea that replicating stereotypes in what is called predictive analytics is going to just reinforce stereotypes in society and is going to turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy rather than contribute to liberating society and creating justice. And I want these issues to be at the forefront, because this is the time. This is the time. We are hearing a massive global demand for justice. And we've got to hear it and embrace it. And this is the time for us to ask the right questions. And it's happening at a time where companies like Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, Unilever, they're pulling their ads because they know that if unfettered, if uncontrolled, if unaccountable, the architectural persuasion that we've built online by leveraging historic data will only reproduce the stereotypes that we've got in societies. And if you couple that with fake news, deepfakes, micro-targeting, we're not going to create a culture online which enables people to be more free, more themselves, and more liberated. So the issue of bias, which comes from data ingested into the machines, but watch out. And this is the key point I really wanted to make. If there is one point that I wanted to remember, people will try and say that the bias in the outputs of these algorithms comes only because of historic data. It's not true. Please, if people say we can fix it, we can fix a machine, we can fix the algorithm, and by fixing the algorithm, we'll have the perfect response, be aware the answer is no. First of all, because data bias comes in many other ways. And I'll give you an example, which could be a bit shocking, but a bit extreme, but I think it serves the purpose at this stage. So let's say that I decide to use AI to recruit individuals. And instead of having HR people, I say, well, you know what? I'm going to use an algorithm. And I'm going to describe exactly who is my perfect employee. And then I'm going to describe him. I'm going to find them through my current employee, define them, identify, and then using machine learning. Machine learning is, the machine learns what's good and finds correlation and finds patterns and all this. And I'm going to say that for me, somebody who is good employee is somebody who comes to work every day at 8 o'clock in the morning, because for me, punctuality is really important. Now, if my office is based in central London or in central New York, where the rents are $5,000 a month for a flat, who is going to be able to come to work on time at 8 o'clock? The single mum with 2 kids who's got to take them to nursery in the morning? Or the wealthy white man who lives with no wife, no children, by himself in a flat? The reason why I'm mentioning this example, which is rather extreme, is to say the bias doesn't only come because of data, but it also comes because of the values on what's good, what's bad, we put into the system. The proxies and the labels that we choose to define what we like and what we don't like. They say proxies, for example. A postcode, if used, can tell so much about people. It can tell you the color of your skin, how much money you have. And even if, if you're gay or not sometimes. So sometimes discrimination can come in. So there is so much, I think, that we need to understand and unpack. And I'm going to say to you, the concept that is really important in this, and then we can, if you want to, we can go into the details of bias, but bias can come in for data put into the system, the labels that we choose, so how we define what's good or bad, how we evaluate it. It can also come in because you can identify a sample, but then the way that the algorithm works on that sample is very different from how it works across the general population. This happens sometimes in health, where a particular algorithm latches onto data which represents a local community, and then if you use it somewhere else, then it doesn't work, with enormous disastrous consequences of individuals. So the reason why I'm saying this is because we can't be fooled. Do you know why? Because there's so many products in the market that tell you, oh yes, we can fix an algorithm. We can, and I do work with products that I've developed and we have developed, which they look at how we can understand technically when a decision is being made, which part of the algorithm played the bigger role. You can have this, but an algorithmic fix will not be sufficient. And this is why your input as organizations, as individuals, as leaders in the communities is crucial. An algorithmic fix is not going to fix the problem. The issue with data is not just about cleaning the data or data cleansing, but it's about the fact that they reflect structural inequality in our societies. And we can have algorithmic justice, but algorithmic justice is far different from justice in society. And when we deploy these systems to define our welfare state, our policies, drive our policies, and when we define that, then we really need to be very careful not to misunderstand what is the algorithmic justice and fairness that everybody's on at the moment with justice and fairness in society. So the important thing is really understand the bias can come from many different elements, and that a purely algorithmic fix will not going to fix the problem. And I also want to add something else. You may have the most perfect algorithm, which is completely unbiased, completely fair, but you can still use it for completely the wrong thing. And I ask a question about this, and I'd love it to just put questions and comments in the chat. To me, the example of this is facial recognition. Facial recognition is biased and cannot recognize Black faces with the enormous consequences of Black people. And this is why Amazon, for example, they've said we're no longer selling recognition, which is the software for facial recognition, to the police. This is why IBM and Microsoft, they say the same thing, because they want to understand what is the legal framework around all this, but they also want to fix the bias. But I'm going to ask you a question. When the bias is fixed and the machine is perfectly able to recognize a Black person, is the problem solved? Do we still want facial recognition? Do we still want a tool that watches us when we go around in public spaces? Because the thing is, being watched or feeling that you're being watched, even if you're not, changes the way that you behave in the public space. changes the idea of privacy as a fantastic public value. The idea that you can be gay and going to a pub even if your parents don't know, because you're not watched. And it's really important, I think, that we ask ourselves the question. One thing is to fix the algorithm so that it's no longer biased. And one thing is to say, well, facial recognition, we need to understand whether we want it, where we want it, and to understand that the bias around it is not just in the data, but it's in the way that it's used. And this is the same that happened in other areas of AI, such as predictive analytics. The idea that a lot of local authorities at the moment are starting to use artificial intelligence to predict who is going to be vulnerable. The police are using artificial intelligence to predict who is more likely to commit a crime. The problem is that predictive analytics constructs and creates a world of tomorrow based on the inequality in the racialized society of today. So we've got to ask ourselves, are we happy with it? Are we happy with the way that we are letting algorithms predict, curate, target, edit? When you're online and you receive all your recommendations, are we happy to be recommended? And where is the limit? Are we missing out on things that we would be exploring, but we are not? Are we missing out on the news? Are you and I watching different things? And if you and I watching different things, what is democracy if we can't talk about the same things? If we don't know the same facts? What is happening with these machines? Algorithms curate, edit, construct, build, manipulate. And I think this is what we need to have a conversation about. And this is not because we don't love technology, it's the opposite. It's because of the idea that technology can be so good that we want it to work for everybody. And also, we want it to work in the right way. At the moment, there's a lot of debate around ethics. And this is a really interesting one. Because a lot of people are interrogating themselves and saying, well, what is ethics? What does it mean? And a lot of companies, especially in the aftermath of COVID-19, a lot of companies are focusing on how to be good businesses. How do we avoid going back into sort of what was before? But also companies are asking themselves, what does it mean to innovate with purpose? And I think this is a really important moment for us to talk about these particular issues. First of all, because what is happening with COVID, the debate has been laid bare with the tracing app, for example, right? The fact that, with the tracing app, in my view, there has been really all the trends upon which society was built before COVID, they've been laid bare there. Techno-solutionism, the fact that a technological solution must be better than a non-technological one, by default. The fact that surveillance, the fact that, we need that kind of tool. And the third element is the fact that this dichotomy between health and privacy, which is so dangerous. It is very similar to the dichotomy that we had between health and security after 9/11. So dangerous because there should be no dilemma, there should be no dichotomy, because we've got the capacity to have enhancing technology from a privacy perspective. We've got a capacity to pass legislation to define exactly what we're going to use data for. And we have the tools in 2020 to create solid oversight board to ensure the citizens are the heart of this, and we do not sleepwalk into surveillance, and that COVID data today does not become surveillance data tomorrow. The tools are there. People are worried. Yes, of course they're worried. We had Cambridge Analytica. That was research data that then ended up being used for manipulation. Of course people are worried. But it's a good thing that people are worried. And we missed an opportunity with that COVID app because we didn't pass legislation. We didn't enable politics to be at the forefront to this and say, we specify and set out in legislation how long this data is going to be held for, who's going to have access to it, what is not going to be used for, when is exactly going to be deleted. They should have been gone through Parliament. And then we had a debate about COVID apps, which was led by the cryptographers and not by the epidemiologists. How wrong is that? I think in this debate around COVID apps, a lot of people have realized that we've been talking about privacy, security, this dilemma between privacy and health as if there's a dichotomy there rather than something that can go hand in hand. And I think during this pandemic, we've really realized that we've got to do something about this. We've got to rethink the concept of privacy as personal autonomy. We've got to rethink the way that our data is conceptualized, which is a great common public value if handled with care, with privacy at heart, with ethical values. But it's a fantastic public value, all the data that we've got, that we need this data for research. But we can use privacy enhancing technologies to really make it work. That we can find a way which we as a society would deem as ethical in a way that we share data. And maybe we move away from this individualistic approach to consent, which doesn't work anymore in my view. How are we going to navigate the smart world we live in, interconnected, where everything is interconnected, where we browse the internet? If this world, digital world, instead of being built on trust, is built on the illusion of control. Are we going to go through every single privacy notice every 2 seconds? Are we going to read pages of pages of legal documents, which is there to deceive by design? Because nobody has got the time to go through every single thing. And how are we going to navigate smart cities? Going from a smart city to a smart car and then walk into a smart home. We need a system which is based on trust, on rules, and on shared values around what we want with our data in our society. The real issue here is that I think that we've waited such a long time for something to happen on these issues. If you think about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which I know some people are like, oh my God, the GDPR. But in reality, the issue with the GDPR is that it's come too late, in my view. And in meanwhile, that our digital ecosystem has grown wild. The digital ecosystem has become an architectural manipulation and persuasion with sort of this supercomputer, the algorithms pointing at us as we navigate, as we browse the internet, hacking into who we are, hacking into our weaknesses, understanding what we fear so they can target us, like it happened with Cambridge Analytica, where if you were fearing immigration, you would get served ads about how Europe increased immigration. If you were identified and classified as an animal lover, you would get ads about how Europe hates animals. This is what happened to our digital ecosystem. So I think it's really, really important that we as society, as people, as individuals, that we really stop for a moment and say, okay, we've got to go, you know, this is not a topic for techies. This is a topic about shared values, politics, participation, and us being in the digital world, which is as important as us being in the physical world. And at a time where, thank you to people like Greta Thunberg, with putting the physical environment at the forefront, we've got to put the digital one at the forefront as well, because the two are so much interconnected. And they're interconnected for many different reasons, if only because of the computing power that artificial intelligence development need. So it's really, really important to say, okay, this is not just for the techies, this is us. This is about citizenship and democratic participation. And there are solutions in a way that we hold our data. Tim Berners-Lee, for example, as Vladimir was asking, yes, correct. That's one way. That's a, you know, these are all possible solutions. The way, do we need to rethink the way that our digital infrastructures is conceived? Do we need to think, for example, of, you know, big data trust? Do we need to think about new intermediaries between us and organizations handling our and using our data? So that it's not just us and the big company. Sometimes it's so complicated for us to understand what a company is doing with our data. Do we need to rethink this, our democratic and digital participation? So I think what's really important really is to say, okay, this is not just for the techies, this is for everybody. This is about really talking about the digital citizenship as important as the physical citizenship in the physical world we live in. And then we have to really understand that these trends that our world has been built on, techno-solutionism, surveillance, datafication, they are bringing enormous consequences. And as we continue to embed automated decisions done by algorithms into our systems, we are slowly but continuously embedding new risks into the system. So for example, in the US, they talk about automation of poverty, which is basically saying that you are locking people out because of all the things that we talked about bias, that you are locking people out of essential services. If you think about housing or education, which are the true levels in life, this is where equal opportunities come to the fore. You're locking people out of essential services. Algorithms curating, editing. They decide what you get to see and what you don't get to see, based on what is perceived as your personality, based on what you type, you like, what you look at, and not necessarily what you say, but what is inferred about you, because our machines being fed a lot of data, and then making correlations about facts, about behaviors. So this is very much of a sort of sensation as society altogether. How are we going to do it? Tricky one. But surely it's really important that we don't let this debate and the wider topic of ethics and digital ethics in this space being decided by Silicon Valley, because that's not fair. That's us. That's affect us on a daily basis. I see a question from Fiona. I don't know if Fiona wants to speak, but I see Fiona said about GDPR that has enabled many online services to gain rights they didn't have, exactly, because you don't agree to them, you're denied access. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But that is a problem, you know, that again, that is a problem, because so people, I mean, some people talk about privacy paradox. So some people say that it's a paradox because people say that they care so much about privacy, but then they end up accepting everything online. I am in two minds about this privacy paradox, and I'd be happy to discuss, but I don't think it's true fully. First of all, because there is no alternative. So it's not that there's an alternative to Facebook. No, there's an alternative to Twitter. You know, these tools, they've become very much public utilities. Do you see what I mean? They should be treated as such as well, but they've become ingrained in our infrastructure. So there is no alternative. First point. Second point, I do think it's also a matter of presentation. And I don't think people go far enough, and organizations go far enough in identifying ways to present data information to people. So to an extent, sometimes you feel that there is a little bit of deceit by design rather than privacy by design in the way that they deal with this. So in my book, basically, I really wanted to bring together a lot of these topics, and really narrate a story of how, when we talk AI, we immediately think about Terminator and futuristic stuff, but in reality, we should be worried about the here and now. And we should take control and ownership of this discussion as citizens and organizations. We should find new ways to engage with people around what do they want from artificial intelligence moving forward. And we should really look at power, because what is driving AI is very much about power. And everybody's talking about this global AI race. And we've got to be careful about it. A race to what? We've got different models, haven't we? You know, you have China with the social credit scoring, with a different approach to privacy. You've got the US with a very commercial approach to data, although things are changing with CCPA in California and hopefully with a federal law. A different way, which is a European way, which is sadly the UK is not going to be in Europe, but you know, but we've got a European way, which is says, well, artificial intelligence has to be constrained by our human values. Human must remain at the center of what we do. As in another way of putting it, which I always share, technology has to serve us and not us serving technology. Because at the moment it feels as we are adapting to tech rather than technology adapting to us. And I think everybody feels this with COVID-19. We are adapting to tech all the time rather than say, okay, tech, artificial intelligence, these things, they're here to serve us, not vice versa. And then, you know, we need to have a discussion, and close on this, we'll have to have a discussion as citizens around what kind of regulation we establish. And this is where the propaganda starts. You know, you'll hear a lot of people saying, oh, artificial intelligence regulation is going to stifle innovation. And I always say, well, sectors were very regulated, like pharmaceutical. I mean, are they really victims of regulation, or is actually regulation something that, if done properly, enables companies to thrive because it gives them a little bit of clarity about liability, about the use of data, about how not to get into to receive massive fines? And of course, you know, if you think about regulation as swiping things coming, sweeping things coming and changing, and then I don't want that. But the key things is, do we have enough legislation at the moment, or even better, does the current existing legislation work for the harms of algorithms? We don't know. If the harms of algorithms is, as we said before, being locked out of services, stereotypes replicating, do we have enough legislation at the moment, or is that the law enough to protect us? That is the question. And if it's not, well, you know, we've got to put it in place. So that is where I think we need a bit discussion. But the reason why I wrote my book is really because I want AI to be discussed at the kitchen table, at the pub, at the bar, to be a topic that is left to the techies. And I think now there is one more issue, compelling issue to do so, and that is the Black Lives Matter movement. Just
Cutting out there, there you go. You're back with us.
Yeah, back now. So I would say the one issue that has made this topic become very, very relevant right now, even more than it was so before, is Black Lives Matter. And it's the global call for justice and for an end of anti-Black racism that has really reminded everybody that ignorance cannot be an excuse. And to an extent, has also reminded everybody of the risk of these systems to perpetuate discrimination. And if we're not careful, we will just allow these machines to scale up the stereotypes we've had in society so far. And if we do not move away from AI being used for surveillance and computing advertising, and we say, well, we want AI to focus on the big things that matter in the world, the environment, health, that's where tech should be. Then I think this is the time where we need to say, well, you know, we want ideas and politics back in the driving seat. And, you know, things are changing. Even the big tech, they are realizing that without that trust, without the ability for us as consumers and citizens to trust what they do, they're going nowhere. So even, you know, we are in a situation where things are changing. So I think, you know, this is the time to really open up with friends, with colleagues, and say, AI is not just about tech. Technology is much more than tech. Technology is really about power. It's really about how we want to see the world tomorrow. And that cannot be left to a few people, but that has to be something that we discuss together. So that's it for me.
I've got the world's wonkiest trackpad on this computer, and I was like furiously trying to scroll over to unmute, and then I'm like, I'm not gonna be able to unmute by the time I get there. Thank you so much, Ivana. That was like super interesting. It was really good. There's actually some people on Twitter who are in the room who were tweeting about how interesting they were as well, which was lovely. Amy said that was mind blowing, which is good. I think it's probably given a lot of people in the room food for thought about where AI and tech ethics are shaping the way that their charity looks, and actually a lot of charities that are kind of, I was going to say blundering, that's not fair, but are kind of unwittingly becoming a partner with some of these bigger tech companies, whether it's Facebook or whether it's some of the people providing their CRMs or any of the platforms that they're operating on, and actually being part of that and not really making big decisions ethically about whether that's okay or not. So it'd be good, we can open up questions from the room. I'm conscious some of you are in video, some of you are not. So if you're not in video, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can use the chat box. Any questions just now for Ivana before we just have a general discussion? Okay. I think when it's such a big topic as well, it's like thinking of like the one question you're going to ask is like so incredibly difficult. I think I've got a question, I guess, partly for the room and partly for you. Is that I'd be interested to know if there's lots of people, there's some people in this room who work in government, some people in public sector, that I've just noticed some of the names, and there's some people most people working in charities. Has anyone in the room had these types of discussions either at a kind of senior management level or a board level where there's been decisions, or even just a general discussion about tech ethics and what you should and shouldn't be getting involved in and making decisions around that? Has that ever come up? Okay, there's a lot of shaking heads. Okay, I guess then throwing it back to you, Ivana, do you have any thoughts on if people want to get started in thinking about that in particular? Sorry, Pat, you were going to come in there.
I think you're on mute. Oh, no.
I'm in my 70s, so I've spent most of my career without tech. And I've been involved in welfare rights, all of these areas. I know the rules and how to sort of challenge those situations. I've recently watched the Cambridge Analytica review in Parliament.
Yeah.
And I was incredibly shocked, and I agree that we need to take control of the technology and not the other way around. That was my thinking at the end of all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Cambridge Analytica stuff was disconcerting, wasn't it? I mean, there was research data that then ended up used for this. I mean, do you know what the problem is? The problem is that what these algorithms do, yeah, they take a lot of data and they create correlations. So what happens is they're able to identify whether, it may not be true, but to identify whether somebody is, for example, soon to have a nervous breakdown, or if somebody's nervous, and they categorize people. You know, they're able to really categorize people, and then they can target people down to their specific. And this is called the behavioral micro advertising. So now you're able to advertise to somebody based on their specific feeling or what is perceived as their specific feeling. So obviously, when you use all this for political purposes, then that becomes really complicated and really dubious from an ethical perspective.
Mm-hmm. Making assumptions and not checking things out. Yeah.
Exactly. And then the other thing, you worked in welfare. It's really interesting because what is happening now with the welfare is and probably COVID has been the perfect situation. The partnership between the big tech and government. So now you have the partnership between government and Google and Apple on the analytics and on the trap, the contact tracing app. And finally, what to collect and what not to collect is being defined not by government but by Apple.
Yeah.
And Google. So it's all quite interesting in terms of who's got the power now. Is that the big tech, or is it government, and how do you navigate that partnership? So these are really tough questions, and I think the problem is that we've let it happen, and it's been probably good because a lot of it has been the initiative of Silicon Valley and really innovative products, but the question is, without governance and regulation, I think could become quite dangerous.
Yeah, agree. Thank you.
So there is a question from Mary Wilson. What do you think of the work between the Information Commission and the Alan Turing Institute? Yes, so I suppose, yes. And that's a really interesting question. So in the UK, there are different bodies. So in the UK, you have the Information Commissioner, which looks at personal data, right? They've recently developed an algorithmic auditing framework, which is now up for consultation. So it's basically saying, do you know what, algorithm to decide whether somebody can have access to a loan, we can audit it. And it's within the GDPR, the possibility for this to be audited. Then you've got the Center for Data Ethics, which is, they've recently issued the AI Barometer, which is rather interesting document you may want to take a look at. And it's done with industries and looks at the barriers and the fears and the concerns the companies have in different areas around the deployment of AI. And then there is a plethora of other organizations working on this. I mean, the Alan Turing, obviously, but then you have the Ada Lovelace Foundation. There's a lot of... So there is, do we need a new regulator? Or do we need to skill up the regulators in different areas? First question. Regulating AI in health is probably very different from regulating AI in finance. For example, the concept of explainability is very different in finance from it is in another area. So that's one. The other question is, regulator for what? My view is that we need some sort of understanding what due diligence in these systems is. And I always use this example. So if you go on a plane tomorrow, you're not going to open the engine on the plane to see how it works because you don't know. But you trust the plane. Why? Because of the regulation around aviation. And because you know that whoever's put that engine on that plane, they follow due diligence. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to fly. So translating that, my question would be around, what does due diligence mean? That you have GDPR. So there are issues around, compliance with GDPR. There are areas that are probably beyond GDPR that need to be taken into consideration. And the other thing is, what is the due diligence? Who checks it? Who can do audits, random audits? For example, what is the sort of, how do we solve the problem between copyright, commercial interest, and auditability? And perhaps the other issue would be, what about redress? Do we need a sort of redress body? And the other thing would be, a lot of people now talk about this explainability thing, it's a big issue at the moment, so I need to be able to understand why a particular decision has been made about me by an algorithm. And sometimes I think that's fine. But to be honest, the conversation between us, I also think, do I really want to know? Or if there is 10 pages of a document, what purpose is that going to serve? And I may have the capacity to go and understand it, and you on this call as well. But isn't that transparency going to fail exactly the most vulnerable who need the transparency the most? That's the kind of questions I'm asking myself. So why don't we, maybe the effort has to be on the licensing. Do we need a licensing agency? For data ethics is probably the body which will have most of the answers to this. They've done some really good work. Obviously, privacy is crucial and data protection. So the Information Commissioner will be closely linked to all of this. There is a strong intersection, obviously, between ethics and privacy, if anything, because a lot of the ethical decisions, they're related to the use of personal data. But it's how we regulate all this is not an easy one. And also, the EU is going towards an interesting model but once Britain leaves the EU, what happens? Is this country gonna be, we want all sorts of data experimenting, so we're more competitive, or we'll be aligning to what the EU is going to do? Hard to know.
I'm wondering, we've got a wee bit of time before we finish up, Ivana, and if Anna's got a question. Sorry, we'll get Anna's question in, and then I thought once we've heard from Anna, it'd be good if you'd be happy maybe summing up how you think charities can start to have these conversations. I think that's, as a starting point, it's not even how do we make decisions, where a lot of charities aren't even there yet. It's like, how do we even have these conversations at a senior level or at a board level so that we can understand some of these decisions we're making? And particularly the interest in the HR one, because I was working with quite a big social care charity, and we're looking at HR and recruitment, and HR and recruitment and social care is broken. It's like, it's not worked for decades. It just is a mess. They have a churn of people, and there's a real lack of understanding as to why they have that churn and what they do about it. And what we're seeing is more of a creep in around AI to try and help make those decisions. But there's not a lot of people in the third sector ethically thinking if we are recruiting for these workforces that are into the tens of thousands, often some of the lowest paid people in society, how do we let AI make decisions around that? And so, yeah, it'd be quite interesting. But we'll hear Anna's question first, and then you can maybe finish with some thoughts on that.
Thanks, Ross. Thank you, Ivana, for a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. At Close the Gap, we've been developing a piece of work on gender and automation. So we work on women's labour market equality in Scotland. So I was particularly interested in your thoughts on the challenges of addressing discrimination and bias within AI. And you might know that Scottish Government is in the process of developing an AI strategy just now. And so I wondered what your thoughts were. You kind of touched on the need for baking into the system the due diligence that's required. And I suppose from a sort of practical point of view, I wondered what particular type of measures that you think, and you have sort of touched on those, but in particular, I'm interested in impact assessments. So it's been suggested in a number of places that having some sort of ethical impact assessment or would be a useful measure to have in place. And from our own experience at Close the Gap, where, and in Scotland, we have the public sector equality duty, where public bodies have been required to do equality impact assessments for a number of years. So that's been a legal requirement. But the experience is that it isn't done very well. It's done unevenly, to a poor quality, and hasn't resulted in any improved outcomes for women in employment or any other aspects of life. And so I suppose I wondered whether or not you're aware of any examples where impact assessments have been used in this context effectively, or you have any other views on that, really, I suppose.
So that's really interesting, okay, so it's true what you're saying. I mean, the equality impact assessment and I mean the obligations upon public sector is there. The problem is, you know, that especially it wasn't done properly before. Now with the use of AI and the lack of knowledge around the wider implication of artificial intelligence on gender, things could get even more difficult to articulate. So there are two things, I think. First of all is there are two kinds. First of all is understanding what the harms of AI are, right? So we said so one is to be locked out, right? So you can have women being locked out of services, or for example, it often happens that because historically women have got less buying power and less financial capacity, then they could be locked out of credit because of this. And this is happening, and it happens quite often. Then you've got the second one, which is representational, which is the fact that by injecting historic data and by different labels that you use, AI could represent women in a traditional way, thus reproposing stereotypes to the back door. And the third one is around correlation and causation. So what happens is that sometimes algorithms mix up what is a correlation between elements with a causation, which is a real thing we're interested in, which is when something is caused by something else. How these harms are mitigated requires a process in organizations. So equality impact assessment, algorithmic impact assessment, fine. But the problem is that what should happen is there should be a determination of how an organization is tackling these issues from a corporate perspective. So who is involved in the decisions, for example, around what product to develop or what product to buy? Who is the person, who is the team, who is the wider organizational effort to determine what are the intended and unintended consequences around the deployment of a particular program? This is really important because the unintended consequences, sometimes a particular product which looks great, that may have unintended consequences in 2, 5 years, 10 years down the line, which is totally detrimental to women. And the problem is that, especially now, the public sector is taking products off the shelf with little auditing. The problem is who is going to make that decisions for whether their product is fit for purpose or not. And that requires serious procurement guidelines. It requires that companies, before the deployment and the development and deployment of a specific product, they have a structure at organizational level that can deal with the consequences of it. And the development of, I call it algorithmic impact assessment, which is not much different from an equality impact assessment. So the one I've developed looks at intended and unintended consequences, data. But the key thing is how, this is not a tick the box exercise. And the key thing is, I always say to cut organizations, I would say, you've got to do this with the people who are going to be impacted the most. So if you use artificial intelligence, for example, in recruitment, if you use it in, I don't know, financial services, or if you use it in education, who are the people going to be impacted the most by this? And they need to be involved in the determination of what the intended consequences of their product might be. So the issue is, what is the ethics strategy that a company is going to deploy when artificial intelligence comes in? Whether the product is developed, or, and the strategy could be different. Some organizations set up an ethics boards, some organizations create different relationship between domain experts, some organizations skill up the entire workforce on understanding what ethics is. It really depends. Does that answer a little bit, or are you after something more specific?
No, that's helpful. And I suppose actually at the end, I was thinking that one of the reasons why quality impact assessment hasn't worked very well so far in public bodies is because there's that lack of gender competence among the doing the quality impact assessment. And I suppose, as you've mentioned at the end there, that there's a number of different strategies, but I suppose you have to understand why Black and minority ethnic people and women and other protected groups will be differentially impacted by these. And so I suppose your point on upskilling the workforce or the functions of an organisation who are leading on that work is really important.
But also, you know, if you look at the concept, for example, of fairness, which is very crucial in AI, then it's really important for an organisation to understand what a fairness means to them. So if, for example, and for this moves to question that Ross was asking, but also yours. I mean, for example, if you use AI in recruitment, right? You say, I want to recruit 50% women and 50% men. Then in order to an AI system to be unbiased and fair, in a way, you need to make an active social decision that you want it to be unfair. Because if you don't make that decision, you just, you know, you will just replicate how society is out there right now, which is both biased and both unfair. So if you want to the output of that decision to be, so when you use AI in recruitment, that is particularly problematic. Because in that case in particular, what you need to do is you really need to say, okay, what is, if I use this system, for example, and I determine what is good, what is bad, what is a good employee, what am I after, what is the potential bias, what are the potential consequences of some segments of society and some vulnerable segments of society. You may not know at the beginning. And also you need to really be careful and say, okay, this is how I'm going to deploy. This is the algorithm. The data can come in at the injection of the data, when you build the sample, when you evaluate the labels and the proxies, at the metric stage, at the measurement stage, at the evaluation stage. So a bias could come in at every single stage of the product. What does that mean in practice for that company? Once the product is out there, before you test it, who is going to be tested on? How is it going to be evaluated in long term? What is the consequence? all this stuff needs to be taken into consideration. If for example, in recruitment, you are using face to detect somebody, if somebody's reasonable, if somebody's trustworthy, I mean, how are we going to really look at companies not buying or using products which are, first of all, biased, but also based on bogus science? Because I do not think that you can understand people's, if they're reasonable or not, or if they're trustworthy or not, by the way they move their eyes or their face. You can have a product like that defines people if they're trustworthy or not based on the way they move their face, and is completely unbiased. But still, would you really do that? Would you really use that kind of product? This is where ethics comes in sectors like human resources. So the key thing for me is, how do we make sure that the products that we deploy and we develop, they are there to augment human capabilities with human at the heart, and they're there to support humans? That's the key thing. I mean, I'm lucky to work with organizations that, you know, they want to do the right thing, because I mean, some of it, they want to do the right thing because obviously they've got a reputation, they care about their data, and they want to set up the right governance, the right strategy, they want to do it right. And they're ready to be challenged and say, you know, how do we, these things only work where ethics considerations are able to trump over commercial ones. And it's really important. And to be honest, this is the time when things like this are happening. Companies like what we're seeing in the last few days, you know, where companies say, we're going to stop the ads. Yes, that means less money. But it is happening. So this is the time to really take up this conversation, talk about digital ethics, familiarize with these topics. There are so many amazing books. Create that link between this and BLM. Really create that link and say, you know, why do we need this governance online? Because the digital ecosystem has grown wild into something which is really not what should be. It could be a different thing. And, you know, we can have a technology to serve humans, to really make society better, for as long as we are capable of really bringing in legislation when we need to, alongside self-regulation, but also really say us getting involved in challenging some of the things that we have grown used to. I'm available by email for questions. You can sign up to the newsletter, the Women Leading in AI. It's Women Leading in AI website. It's an organization of sort of women and not just women, friends from across the world with looking at the governance of AI. And it's a really nice sort of place to be. So yeah, so it's really good if you just sign up and then email me, and we can keep the conversation going.
Amazing, thank you, Ivana. That was excellent. Just a wee round of applause for Ivana. That was superb.
It's fine.
It was like really interesting. The link to Women in AI, which you mentioned, Siobhan's just put that in the chat. Jen does a hard job after all these sessions. That big Google Doc that we mentioned at the start, we've got all the sections in there that are all categorized. So we'll get all the resources from the chat today, and we'll put those in there. The other thing to say is there's now a lot of really nicely grouped resources that sit in the SCVO digital site. So I'm pointing that way just because Siobhan's like to the left of me on the many Zoom screens, as if like you're all going to see me pointing to Siobhan. It's how ridiculous. I've like done a million of these Zoom calls now, and I'm still like can't do it. So there's some really good stuff on the SCVO digital site as well. We've got some free training which has been running for a week or so now. So we do 2 training sessions a week, so there's 2 90-minute workshops. So SCVO, Health and Social Care Alliance, RS McDonald Charitable Trust, and the Catalyst have supported those. So the next one coming up is, and it's quite timely actually given some of the stuff we've spoken about, is on the 1st of July, which is around using Microsoft Power BI. So if you're interested in thinking about how you understand some of the data that your charity holds, and how you make sense of that data and how you can make simple dashboards out of that data, then we've got a session on that. Aileen, who's done a lot of work with DataKind, is going to be running that one. And then on the 6th, we've got Maddie, who's in Siobhan's team. So Maddie is going to be running a session on how you can communicate more effectively internally. And so obviously for a lot of you, we've seen quite a big shift to tools like Teams and to Slack, but often very little structure put around how you're going to be using these tools and how you can make those tools more human, rather than it just being like we've now decided we're ditching email and we're just going to this other thing. So you can put some structure around how your internal comms works. Siobhan, anything from an SCVO point of view you want to kind of bring up?
So just thank you to Ivana, that was amazing, a lot of food for thought, and as you've said, it will be discussed around kitchen tables. I don't think I've come from a DigiShift that I've thought I must talk to all my friends about this, but I certainly will on this one. So as Ross says, they have the curve training session, so I've just put the link for that in the chat, and our 2 upcoming scheduled DigiShifts this Thursday for trustees. So whether you are a trustee or you want to try and influence your trustees to think more about digital, that one's for you. And the next scheduled one is on the 14th about accessibility and user experience. We will have one next week. We're planning that to be looking again at safeguarding, because that's something that a lot of people have raised again. Obviously very relevant to today's conversation as well. We're just waiting to hear final confirmation from the speakers. So we'll let you know the time and the day that will be, likely to be Tuesday or Thursday again, but we'll confirm that once we know for sure. And then, as Ross said, there's a lot of information on the SCVO website. So I've posted the link to the cybersecurity misinformation page. But if you go up a level or 2 from that page as well, there's also how-to guides on remote working and digital inclusion and how to develop your own digital services. So those are all there as well. One thing we're really interested to hear is your own stories and the work that you're doing yourselves. Obviously the charity sector is hugely important in society right now. So there's a Never More Needed campaign across the UK, which SCVO is a part of. So if you're telling your own stories of your service users, any impacts that you've made, please share that with the hashtag Never More Needed, and we'll pick up on those. Our news team, Third Sector Force, would also like to write a news story if you have any stories you want to share. So I will pop a link for that also in the chat. And they can also share your own events. So they have a weekly bulletin that they send out around charities across Scotland. So you can also add your own stories into that as well. So I'll just pop those links in a minute. And that's everything from SCVO. Thank you, Ross.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Thanks, Ivana, that was such an interesting session.
Thanks to you.
Yeah, thanks for coming along. Do go and have a look at Ivana's book as well. We put the link in to the chat at various times, but we'll put the link in again to that document so you can all